Hey everybody, I'm Lindsey, board certified ocularist at Prosthetic Artists Incorporated in Sacramento, California. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to make a scleral shell prosthesis with clear edges. So a traditional scleral shell is opaque all the way to the edges. This becomes a problem when the eye moves and you can see the edges. This ruins your illusion of a natural looking eye. The shell we're going to make today with clear edges is made by painting directly on clear acrylic. Let's go ahead and get started. So when I'm painting on the surface of any eye, I have to maintain my direction of gaze from the model to the final product. I use grid lines, and I check my grid lines against a rubber band. And this is something that I constantly check while I'm painting to make sure that my final product is going to be looking straight. So the final shell is going to be less than 1/2 millimeter thick, and we need to cut away enough clear to allow for the paint and allow for clear acrylic to cover the surface. So since we are not painting around the border, we really don't have to cut away out here because there's not going to be any paint. So I'm going to show you how I cut this down, and so that I don't cut through it, because that's disastrous. But I cut enough away so that the final shell will have enough clear over it to still cover all the paint. So I need to be able to see how much I'm taking away. And what I do in order to do that is I just draw a grid on the posterior of the shell with a marker, and that gives me a reference point so that I don't cut away too much. This is my anterior posterior gauge, and it shows me the thickness of the shell. So right now we can see that it's just over 1/2 millimeter thick. I use this to measure how much acrylic I've taken away. And we got to make sure there's enough to go over the paint. This is my steel barrel burr, my favorite one. Nothing works like it. I'm using very light pressure and just going over it over and over, taking off very little material in it for each pass. So at this stage, I've removed a little bit of plastic all around. I've left the edges because there's not going to be any paint there. Now I use my finger to gauge the thickness. If I can feel my burr through the plastic, I know I've gone far enough. Once I can feel the burr moving over my finger through the plastic, I don't want to cut down there anymore. If you go through, that's a total fail. The amount of border that you leave depends on your patient. If your patient has a nice white sclera underneath, you can leave a little bit more border. If it's very red, then you'll probably want to move your border out, especially nasal, so that you can paint and cover up the redness. I'm going very slow. I'm starting to feel the burr moving over my finger, and that's how I know that I'm thin enough. and I've taken away enough material over the surface. So you can see my thickness at about 1/4 millimeter. So I have a nice even surface and it's ready to paint. So my paint, I like to use oil paints. I like Gamblin and I like Utrecht brand. The Utrecht white, it's a mixture of titanium white and zinc white. Titanium white is very opaque. Zinc white is more translucent. So I like to use a mix because it gives me more control over the opacity of the paint that I'm using. This is my palette. I have yellow ochre, I have raw umber, I have alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, ivory black, just works better than lamp black, and cobalt blue. And these are pretty much the only colors I ever use. First thing we need to do is paint our sclera and paint the location of our iris. So when we finish painting, it's going to look like this. It'll be opaque in the middle and it'll move out to translucency all the way to clear at the edges. Here we go. So now you can see that our grid lines are starting to hide behind the paint. We want to make sure that our margins are nice and blended out to the edges. Keep that brush moving fast and light. As you get some color laid down, you can start using a bit more pigment. So when your sclera is opaque enough, then you can lay in your iris. And I want my iris to be just as opaque. So I use black. You can use gray. But for me, black is the best base to paint on. So when you're satisfied with your iris position and size, go ahead and seal it with your clear monopoly. Allow it to dry. And now you're going to lay in your blood vessels. You can't move these around because you'll move your paint, so you only have one shot to lay them down. I only do a few at a time. So at this point we can remove the grid lines in the back. Maybe that'll help us see better while we're painting. So I'll go do that. Okay, now for painting the iris. The first thing I do is lay in the texture on top of the black. So I take a very light color. If I'm painting a brown eye, I just use my yellow ochre. If I'm painting a blue eye, I'll mix a nice light gray color. Fast and light. laying in your texture, and you can do it straight. You can do straight striations or figure eights, but they gotta be fast and light. It's important to have a really good brush when you're laying in your texture. More opacity in your mixture is going to give you more texture. So when I paint an iris, I use the same technique as in oil painting, where I paint back to front. I start with my black background, then I add the texture. Then if there's a colorette around the pupil, maybe it's a little lighter. Maybe it's brown, maybe it's a red brown. I'm going to lay that in next, and I'm going to lay the pupil in last. All your colors should be organic, and the best way to make a color organic is to add its complement. Take blue and mix orange, you're going to get gray. You're going to get those neutral colors that you find in nature. If you leave your limbus too hard, your eye is going to look like a doll eye. The edge needs to be nice and soft. Obviously, you want to paint what you see, but especially on these thin shells, when you don't have the illusion of an anterior chamber, you really need to soften that limbus.